What do you mean there was a city called Etzanoa? A city with 20 to 30,000 people, all Native Americans, and it remained hidden for over 400 years? I thought Native Americans just lived in teepees. Well, today we talk with Dr. Donald Blakeslee, a professor and archaeologist at Wichita State University in Wichita, Kansas. We're going to talk about the discovery of an ancient Native American city on the outskirts of Ark City, Kansas, where tens of thousands of Wichita tribe lived and traded for several hundred years. How was it discovered, and how has it remained a mystery for all these centuries? I'm Tony Sweet with Captain Ron. Please welcome to the Truth Be Told Studios, Dr. Donald Blakeslee. There he is. Hello, sir.
Howdy.
How you? We always have this canned applause, so thank you for putting up with that. Well, first of all, we want to say welcome back to Captain Ron because he hasn't been in studio for about four months since
it's crazy.
The craziness went down. So welcome back to the studio.
Yes, sir.
But we are excited to have Dr. Donald Blakeslee here. I grew up in Kansas. I graduated from Wichita State in 1995. I'll say, yeah, right. And what we're going to be talking about today, Etzanoa, is a ancient civilization of Native Americans that was like 40 miles from where I grew up. Never heard about it until just a few years ago. And Dr. Blakeslee, so we're going to welcome you to the show and find out, how did this go hidden for so many hundreds of years? I mean, what, 400 years? Can you start with how did it go? How did it disappear?
Well, this town was abandoned sometime around 1700 AD and was taken up when settlers came in as farmland. And people knew there were artifacts there, but no one had connected it for sure with a town that was visited by a Spanish expedition in 1601. And I had read the old documents, or the old translations of the documents, I should say, and had kind of shrugged. I couldn't figure out where it was. And then a team from Berkeley did retranslations of all of the documents. And when I ran across those and read them, I thought, this is much clearer. And it occurred to me to check the verbal descriptions of the Spaniards against the archaeological record where we knew there were sites. And when I did that initially, I got a match in terms of the distribution of what we had recorded as separate sites, 20 some of them, matched the length of the town. So then I went down there with those descriptions in hand and checked every single item of the landscape that was mentioned and got a matches all the way around. And then the clincher was there was a battle fought there. And when I pulled together all of the seven separate accounts of that battle and reread them, I went, oh, I know where that is. I've already been there. And it's in somebody's backyard, essentially. And it's a very distinctive spot, a ravine that's lined with rocks. And so in 2015, we took some metal detectors and found a piece of what's called canister shot. It's essentially a shotgun load for a cannon, and it was iron shot. Lead shot is everywhere. Iron shot is not. It's the only piece I've ever seen.
Wow. And
then later on, when we did some more work, we found a second piece of the same sort. So that really clinched it. If you can predict where you're going to find things, then you know you're on the right track.
How long did that take? I mean, did you go right to the spot?
Yes and no. We went right to the spot, but there were three of us, the landowner and a friend of mine and I, with metal detectors, and we spent several hours digging up junk. It turned out the ravine where the battle took place, which is at the south end of that site, had been a picnic ground since 1900 or so. And so there were pop tops and all sorts of things there. And the grandson of the landowner was tagging along behind. And finally, I realized I'd been torturing this kid. He was 11 years old and he'd been walking behind me for 2 hours. And I said, have you been paying attention? And he said, oh, yeah. I said, would you like to try this? Oh, yeah. And so I handed the metal detector to him and he went off. And the rest of us were talking over what we'd found and being discouraged. And he came up and he said, I found this really weird thing. I don't know what it is. And that was the canister shot.
How cool. That's great.
Yeah, he was really happy.
I'll bet.
Well, growing up, like I said, growing up in Granola, Elk County, which, like I said, 40 miles away, we used to go out and find arrowheads all over the place around where I grew up, and there's other indications that there was a lot of Native Americans in that area. And what was?
Wait a second. This is 50 miles southeast of Wichita State.
Right.
Where are you?
I'm about 70 miles southeast of Wichita.
Okay.
So I'm in Elk County.
About half by between.
Yeah, Cali County is next, which is Winfield and Ark City, which is funny because there were more people in this Native American city than pretty much Winfield and Ark City almost combined, which is pretty crazy.
It's amazing. Is that the big thing that's amazing about this site, Doc? That they're so large?
Yes, that is exactly what's intriguing about it and what the mystery is. But the other thing I should say is it's not the only one.
Really?
Oh, no, there are others. And I've been working with a landowner up in Rice County, which is north of Wichita, about 90 miles. And he has been looking between the recorded sites and finding more and more stuff. And it turns out there are a whole series of these towns that were in the place that the Spaniards called Quivira. And we have looked at the temporary campsites that these people used and mapped out those that we know of. And I've calculated the area, and it's larger than the Republic of Ireland.
Wow. Well, yeah, I don't think people realize that the site we're talking about here, the first site, is 5 square miles, and it had over 20,000 people. I mean, I don't think people think of...
I'm showing a map of it. I believe.
Yeah, it's incredible.
Is this the map right here, Dr. Blakeslee?
That's the map, right. And you go upstream about 4 miles, and you come to the start of the next town, which runs probably another 5 miles or so. And then up 20 miles upstream, there's another one.
Wow.
So and there's one off to the west as well that we haven't investigated yet.
So why do you think, I mean, for 2 questions. Why do you think the history that we learned, like we said, it was just little tiny villages? That's what I learned growing up, even in that area, and movies, everything else, to now finding out there were huge cities, and to think 20 to 30,000 people, were they wiped out by Spanish, the New America?
They weren't COVID 1700.
Right.
I'm telling you, right? It was smallpox.
Well, smallpox, yeah.
Right, Doc?
Well, that's part of it.
Yeah.
The historic period was not kind to the Wichita. They dominated the southern plains at the beginning of the historic period. And then several things. Well, first, New Mexico happened. And
Right.
when it became a permanent colony, say 1610 with the founding of Santa Fe, they were trying to make an economy, and they found no mineral wealth to speak of. And so they ended up initiating a slave trade, taking native captives and selling them down to the ranches and mines down in what is now Mexico. And in return for this, they were giving the Apaches horses and steel weapons, not guns, but other weapons. And so the Apaches had an enormous advantage over all of their neighbors and began raiding. There was an expedition in 1630 that got as far as the Ark River And the only account we have of it, which is very brief, said the guides, that is the Apaches, were afraid to cross the river into Quivira because at that time they were enemies. Previously, they had been allies and friends. So you had mounted warriors from the west, and then the French came in to the Mississippi River Valley in 1699, and they also initiated a slave trade, and they gave firearms to their native allies. And so you had raiders from the west with horses and steel weapons, and you had raiders from the east with guns. And the Wichitas were not able to stand up to that. And then you add to that the infectious diseases that came in, COVID 1700. The first account we have,
Right,
which is not necessarily the earliest one, is 1699.
wow.
Tremendous smallpox epidemic. So they gradually moved south. First to northern Oklahoma, then down to the Red River, then down into Texas.
Oh, okay.
And then, to make things worse, Texas happened.
Right.
The Republic of Texas had a native and Indian policy that was no natives allowed, period. And so they were driven from pillar to post.
Unbelievable.
Kind of opposite now.
Yeah, it's like the protest now. It's unbelievable. But Doc, didn't these cities have more technology too than we realize?
Yeah,
like
I'm
they
curious
had
about that.
beans and corn they were growing, and they had they spoke different languages. They traded with different groups.
Yeah, well, that's what I'm working on right now, is trying to track out the why. When in 1542, when Coronado came through, he came through northern Quivira, and he wasn't as all that impressed, but he's still talking about populations that were probably larger than in those counties today. But it looks as though he came during a period of rapid growth that continued after he left, and it's 60 years before Oñate shows up with his little army. And people apparently were moving in from all directions and joining this very, very successful society. And it's got to be more than corn and beans to draw people. They were growing crops. The town lasted, as far as we can tell from radiocarbon dates, for 300 years or so, 250, 300 years of permanent settlement. And the draw appears to have been the trade that they were able to initiate, trading bison products of various sorts. And that's what makes the sites distinctive, is the evidence of really, really intensive bison hunting.
Mm-hmm.
And production of robes and leather and rawhide and dried meat and whatever you can get from a bison, which is a lot of stuff.
Right.
And Native Americans were like, they talk about the meat industry today, that you take everything from the pig except the squeal.
Right.
Well, that's what they were doing with the bison.
Well, I grew up with my dad was a butcher, so we.
Oh, was he?
Oh yeah, and my cousin, my grandma's first cousin, they called him Wild Bill. He had the big long handlebars, and he actually raised bison for a long time.
No kidding.
Yeah.
There you go. Right. See, it shows that
Right
the
in the
history's
backyard.
right there in
Right.
the backyard. But they had the technology of these giant beehive shaped houses that held 10 or so people, right? I mean, that seems not what we picture. Again, we picture these little teepees, and yet it's this big beehive.
Showing some
Right.
pictures.
That sketch you're showing is not exactly accurate. The photograph behind you also is a lot closer. That's a reconstructed house. Yeah, the accounts of the Spaniards are very interesting. It turns out that the wall posts, they were set into the ground out at the perimeter of the house, were split cedar logs that were probably 40, 50 feet long each one.
Amazing.
And then tied together at the center. to make this beehive-shaped structure. And then they're covered with thatch, big bundles of dried grass, which in England, there's still cottages, there's still people who do thatching, and thatch will last for years if you do it right. So it sheds the water. It's also really good insulation. It's, thick. It traps the air. The only trick is having a fire inside. If your house is made out of
Right.
out of straw, that's a danger.
You don't want to fall asleep with your cigarette, so.
No, but they had what's not shown. No, you can't see in those photographs. They had a smoke hole, and what they would do is they would take a bundle of grass and make a wreath, very tightly wound, and then they would smear that with clay and put it up there so that any spark that hit it wouldn't ignite their house. But even so, you don't use green wood. No snap, crackle, and pop allowed.
Right. Well, I was going through pictures, and I want to show you this picture because a lot of times Native Americans created like mounds and rituals and petroglyphs and even sometimes hieroglyphs like Egypt. But is this picture accurate that it was discovered around that area?
Oh, this is the Serpent Intaglio up in Rice County.
Oh, so this is in Kansas.
It was the first such thing to be discovered, and what they've done there is they outlined it with or filled it in with lye, and it's not absolutely accurate.
Okay.
But it's pretty darn close. And years ago, I discovered the remains of a second one up in the northern part of the state. Only the head end remains. The rest of it was destroyed by farming activity.
Oh, man.
And it was a close thing. This serpent was discovered by a guy named Clark Mallam, an old friend of mine. And I had been out there and looked at it. And then we were doing survey up in the northern part of the state. And I was walking down this slope, and there was this kind of little hollow, and I walked through it. And then about halfway down the slope, I got to feeling ashamed of myself. And there was an amateur archaeologist who was volunteering with us. And I said, come on up here. And we stood in, and I said, do you see anything? And she said, well, yeah, a little hollow here, but what about it? And I said, well, have you ever been to the Serpent? And she said, and then old Kansas girl, she said, holy crap. and it did turn out to be a second one.
Oh, cool.
So since then, a third site has been found of the same general sort.
And mostly in Rice County.
Carve into the earth to make symbols.
So that's where I find fascinating because like the one down in South America.
Yeah.
There's a lot.
Nazca,
and then there's one up in
Ohio.
Minnesota? The mound.
The serpent mound in Ohio.
Serpent mound in Ohio,
Yeah.
Right? There are others of this sort. Sometimes they're just generally called ground figures.
Mm-hmm.
So there's some south of the Grand Canyon that are pretty big.
Really?
That are stone outlines, yeah.
What is the connection between all these from around our country? Is there any connection in the tribes itself, or just the tradition, or?
Well, I'm not quite sure the question you're asking here.
Well, because like they're very similar, like the mountains, like the serpent mounds and the serpent. It looks like these are serpents in Kansas. Are there any similarities, like connection to the actual tribes itself? Was it like ancestors of each other, or how?
No, probably not direct connections.
Okay.
However, what I'm working on currently is trying to explain why these places are so big. Has to do with the continent-wide network of exchange of information that went from coast to coast. I started by looking for evidence of people using bison products and found it literally everywhere. So When the Spanish came into Florida, there were no bison there, but there were bison horns. More in Georgia, in South Carolina, bison rawhide shields, armor, and helmets.
Wow.
It feels like we continually hear that the world was way more connected in ancient history than we thought.
That's definitely the case. One of the big stories that I'm working on is when the Spaniards got here in 1602. Well, only one of the soldiers happened to mention. We were really surprised when some of the natives spoke to us in what he's called the Mexican language, and we could understand them. He was referring, of course, Mexico didn't exist at that time. He was referring to the Aztecs, to the language called Nahuatl. And here it was being spoken in Kansas. And it turns out that every place with any pretensions to be important had one or more translators.
Really?
Yes. And so that language was spoken from Kansas down to the Texas Gulf Coast and over to California and over a huge, huge region. East in the southeast, I'm not sure if it was Nahuatl. There's a language called the Mobilian jargon that linguists argue about whether it's prehistoric or not. But there was a widespread trade language there. So one may have graded into the other. That would be the simplest explanation. But the Cherokees have some Nahuatl words that they use. So they learned them somewhere.
Doc, I want to ask you about some of the high-tech equipment you guys were using, like remote sensing and ground-penetrating radar to find some of these items.
You even use drones.
Oh,
too.
yes. The thing that what's been most successful is magnetometry. A magnetometer detects a very, very small variation in the Earth's magnetic field, which is changing all the time. So you have two sensors, one that you place near the ground and the other is at the other end of the stick, higher up. That gets you your background signal. And then you walk it, or if you have a cart, push it across the ground, recording the variations, and then use a computer to map the results. When we did that, we found clusters of varied features, both pits and fireplaces. Yeah, this is the kind of equipment. I was looking at an ad of that particular one today. I'm trying to buy one. We're using Park Service equipment.
Got it.
And you know, we have 5 square miles to cover. We need a cart-mounted device.
Right.
The problem is that one of those costs $60,000, and I don't have $60,000 yet.
Tony, maybe you could help out the cause
Sure,
here,
why not?
buddy? All right.
Yeah, no problem.
Sure, yeah, chip in 10 or 20, and I'll be able to get it.
Right.
At any rate, that worked beautifully. We tried a couple of other techniques. The ground penetrating radar did pick up some stuff, but it's not really good for the subtle features we're looking for.
Right.
However, these people were smashing up a lot of bison bone using big flat rocks as anvils, and it did pick those up. Another piece of equipment that got used is thermal imaging with a drone. A guy named Jesse Casana from Dartmouth came out with one of his grad students, and they flew over the site and picked up, there's a giant feature out there that we have not investigated yet, because I want to use every kind of fancy equipment in the world before I dig any dirt out of it. It's the last remaining one of these features. It's a huge circle surrounded by a ditch. That's what he was able to detect. There's probably more going on there. One that was, there were several up in Rice County that were excavated, and they contained structures on the inside and a plaza in the center.
Wow.
And they're clearly ceremonial grounds of some sort.
You know, there's a lot of archaeological sites, maybe a few, that they end up finding another civilization underneath.
Yeah.
Has there been any indications that there was other either mounds or archaeological stuff from before they moved in there, or is it pretty much that era?
No, there's stuff. Depends on where you are in the site. Where we're digging currently is up on the bluff, and underneath is rock.
Yeah, well, can't go down too far.
there's nothing underneath there.
It's a lot of
But
flint.
down in the floodplain, there are earlier materials showing up in various places. And in the general area, it's actually very, very rich in archaeological specimens. So that
you have some with us, right? You're going to show us a couple things there, Doc? You got a couple?
Oh, sure.
Yeah,
sure.
we'd love to see.
Let me start with something really tiny.
Go to your left. There you go.
Perfect.
There we go. Okay, so this is an arrow point.
That's beautiful.
Collectors sometimes call them bird points, but they were not used for birds. They were used to hunt bison. They had really good bows. They had Bois d'Arc, Osage orange wood that they traded for. And so it's the second best bow wood in the world. So a little tiny point like this, made quite narrow, so that it's got lots of penetrating power. Sometimes they would shoot in one side of the bison and it would come out the other.
Oh my God,
that's power.
It is. So arrow points, we've got lots and lots.
Are these all made out of flint? Because flint.
They
hills?
are made out of flint. So that was a gray one. Here's a notched one made out of.
Oh, that's beautiful. Look at
the
that.
local stone. It's heat treated. It turns red when it's heated under a fire. It makes it flake better. So this one has side notches and a base notch. That's a fairly rare form that they made. And here's another. This one's the only one I've got here at home that's out of a kind of stone from Missouri.
This stone's from Missouri?
Little notches at the base, near the base.
Yeah.
So if I turn it around to get the number out of the way, you can see it's pure white material.
So that you said this stone was out of Missouri?
Yep.
So you showed that they were traveling.
We find is the local stuff because they're less than 10 miles from the quarry where they mined this material, and that's another thing they exported. The other big towns in Kansas up to the north all have some of this heat-treated red stone from southern Kansas in significant quantities, but they were also getting their own stone from a variety of sources. But the reverse is not true. 98% of the stone from this site is that one kind of flint, nothing else.
Yeah, that's where I grew up. They call it the Flint Hills.
Oh, well, there you go.
And that's why they call it that. Yeah. Right. Now here's a piece of pottery.
Oh wow, gorgeous.
We find some nice big chunks. This one is, as you can see, I think it's pretty plain. It's been burned in the fire. They made, except for one thing, they made their pottery very, very plain. And the one thing is, well, actually the rim. If I can show you that, you can see that it's been, little incisions in it, but nothing fancy. The handles on the pots, on the other hand,
oh wow,
are often
go to your left a little bit. There you go.
Well, I'm trying to get it here.
There you go. Perfect.
Yeah. Okay. Can you see that's?
I can see the little notches.
Yeah, little punctates in it.
Yep.
And also the side view. Let me turn it this way, perhaps see it easier.
Those bumps seem like that would be for gripping.
Little nodes at the end.
Yeah.
So not terribly fancy, very, very utilitarian.
Right.
The only exception is a very small amount of red slipped pottery that we find, more of that up in the north that was apparently for ceremonial drinks of one sort or another.
So what do you walk away from now that you've uncovered this much of the site? What's the takeaway of this new discovery? How does this change our history?
Oh, well, completely.
Yeah.
In terms of our understanding, those old translations of the documents had been around forever. I'd read them, everybody else had read them. And even the people who specialized in the prehistory of the Wichita tribe tended to write them off and say, oh, well, the Spaniards were exaggerating. And you would think that might be true of the official report of the expedition. But the nice thing is we have interviews with some of the ordinary soldiers, including one who, when they asked him, would you be willing to go back? And he said, well, if you order me to, I will, but otherwise, no. There's no reason to go back there at all, and hence no reason to exaggerate. And he's the one who said that the boss assigned 4 men to count the houses, and he heard the number was 2,000 houses with 10 people per house.
20,000?
He's also the one who, he was on the scouting expedition that saw that other town to the north. And so he said more than 20,000.
Now, how big did cities get pre-Columbian?
Well, the biggest one that we know of is called Cahokia. It's in Illinois, right across the river from St. Louis. Worth a visit if you're ever out that way. You take the interstate, cross the river, and the big hill you see, that's Monk's Mound. It covers 16 acres at the base, and it's one of over 100 mounds there. And that site is about 6¼ square miles.
Well, this is pretty close. This is 5.
Yeah.
And people argue about how many people were there. Okay? And I was there in January to give a talk, and I told them, you got to redo the estimates, because they're going, oh, somewhere between 10 and 25,000 people. No.
More. Has to be more.
More like 50,000 probably.
Wow.
And with loads of suburbs. That site is a real city. It's got structure to it. It's got all sorts of fancy stuff, and it dominated a large area.
I would say so.
My sites are big, but they're not cities. They don't have any real evidence for specialization of labor or fancy elite class of people. Cahokia certainly has that latter. And archaeologists have only recently begun to talk about sites like this all around the world that people have stumbled on, and they're currently calling them mega sites. They get really big, but they do not become cities. They were not headed in that direction. There was something that drew people. Think boom towns might be a good
okay
analogy. They grew and they were there for a while, and mine in Etzanoa for 250 years minimum. That's a pretty permanent town.
Yeah, it's huge.
But it did not, I mean, everybody who belonged lived there. It didn't have suburbs, I guess is the way to think of it.
So it was it sounded like it was a pretty tight-knit community. Do you know anything about the leadership? Because something of that size, was there a chief? Was there like a city council type? How did they run something of that size?
Well, that's a very good question. All we have are the Spanish documents so far. And they do mention that there were 2 chiefs in the town, a big chief and a lesser one. And they actually took the chief hostage. And they didn't realize it at the time. They just grabbed 8 people. But one of them was so important, when they asked him a question, he'd just wave his hand at somebody else, and his assistant would answer for him.
Oh, man.
So,
Ron does that to me all the time.
Right.
Yeah. So probably a hereditary chief. There was their relatives and neighbors also had hereditary priests, and I suspect that would be the case here as well. And those council circles, like the one found with the thermal imaging, they may have held town councils, or there may have been what are sometimes called warrior societies, men's societies that help organize and run things. That's a real good likelihood. A professor named Susan Vayak down at the University of Oklahoma has been investigating those, and that's her tentative conclusion for those council circles. And that seems reasonable to me. It's the kind of thing that you have to have if you're hunting bison the way they hunted bison, which is another one of the amazing things. They were taking thousands of people at a time and walking to wherever the bison herds were and surrounding a whole herd at a time and killing all of them.
Yeah, I was going to say a mass slaughter and just.
And so you need organization, you need leadership.
You'd have to, that many people.
You need teamwork. So they definitely had a social structure, but seeing it archaeologically is difficult.
Yeah, I'm sure.
That red slipped pottery, we suspect, we don't have proof yet, that there were several ceremonial drinks that were in use in North America. And we think they were probably making what's called the black drink, which is a kind of highly caffeinated tea that men would drink before taking part in any important discussions or ceremonies.
Like modern day Red Bull, I guess, huh?
Something like that. If you can imagine chugging Red Bull by the gallon. Okay, they weren't namby-pambies about it. Some of them would drink until they puked. It was what they considered it a way of purifying yourself, but it also put you in a highly alert state.
Yeah.
Another beverage was made with what's called mescal bean, which has nothing to do with the mescal plant, or, well, it has a little bit historically to do with the booze made from it. This is a bean found down in South Texas. It's a red bean when it's ripe. And the description is you take one of these and you boil it in a gallon of water, and then you drink the water. And that's enough to give you visions.
Wow.
We'll try that this weekend.
And the thing for Native Americans that must have been really something is apparently all of the visions are red.
Oh my God. And you pee it too.
Which is a sacred color, so it would have been spectacular.
Wow.
Eventually, we think we'll be able to test the idea about the black drink. I think they were raising the plant on site, and we can look for remains that will tell us whether that's the case or not. Whether the mescal bean is detectable, I'm not sure at this point. It might be. It's going to take some fancy equipment. But here's a little aside that people will like. This bean is called the mescal bean because in South Texas, when the Spanish frontier was there and they were making mescal, the drink, they would add a bean along with the worm to make it a more powerful drink. And so the bean got associated with the booze.
Oh, that's funny. That's funny.
Let's get our hands on some of that,
I
huh?
was going to say, I bet you that'd be a good weekend
you better be
exploration.
tough.
A weekend exploration and take a week just to recover, I'm sure.
Right.
Well, when you were doing a lot of your research, it sounds like this is going to be going on for a long time. That's a lot of area to cover. That's a lot of people's lands you have to go through. I'm sure you're going to miss a lot of stuff underneath, the soil. But how deep is because I know in Kansas you can hit a lot of rock, but there is a lot of great soil. But how deep is this most of the artifacts?
Well, where we're digging, they start a short distance below the surface, but these people made storage pits that they used for storing food until the fungus or insects or rodents got in.
Right.
And then they would empty out the remaining food that they could use and toss trash in. And so this nice big potsherd that I showed you,
Right.
that's from one of the storage pits. So is this. This is
What is that? Is that a
bow
bone?
blade made from the shoulder blade of a bison.
Wow.
The bison shoulder blade would be much, much, much larger
I'm
than
sure.
this, like this. And it had a ridge on it that had to be knocked off and a thick spot on the other side. But what they did was they drilled a hole in the end for the wooden handle to go in.
Wow.
And then they sharpened up this edge here.
Like an axe,
And as
almost
you
like
can
a
see,
club.
this is a very, very, very
wow.
thin at the end.
They ground that down like that?
Well, it's naturally very thin.
Oh, okay.
And these tools did not last all that long. I had a student who made some, and we took them out in the field, and we broke them all pretty quickly. They're fragile. They have to be used carefully. But they were growing crops in their gardens to supplement the bison that they had, and living pretty well with that.
Well, I want to know about because we have just about 10 minutes left, about the rituals. I mean, the ceremonies. Have you found that site? I know you mentioned it earlier. Did you find the site where they did ceremonies? Because Native Americans, that's one of their things they do. They do a lot of ceremonies and rituals. Have you found anything unusual around these sites, or kind of
yes,
standard?
and let me recommend that there's we have a website, we have a presence on Facebook, and people can look up. We funded a video that was made, fairly lengthy video, about 30 minutes, on the Archaeology channel. That's a streaming source. It's called Conquistadors on the Plains. And there's a trailer that they made that they gave us that's only a few minutes that shows one of the ceremonial areas. It's a piece of rock art, only it's not really art in this case. It is and isn't. On a big sloping slab of rock are a whole series repetition of the same basic idea, which is a square hole cut down into this sloping rock so that it's deeper on the upper end. The walls are taller on the upper end. And there's a channel that goes out from that square down the rock. A couple of them actually go into a natural hole in the rock. On the uphill side of the square, the tallest part, they pecked a little opening, like a cave. And I think that's exactly what they intended. They understood the water cycle very well, only they attributed spiritual significance to it. So water comes from the underworld in springs, and the most sacred water and purest water comes from caves, and then flows out onto this earth where people live, and then either sinks back into the ground or rises as vapor up to the sky, forming clouds, producing precipitation again. And what the little trailer video shows is me pouring some water into these squares and filming the passage of the water down across the face of the rock. I think what they were doing there is a type of ceremony that's called a revitalization ceremony, where probably once a year, it was people's job to make sure that the earth continued to operate the way it's supposed to. And so you would have to create another one of these and go through the whole procedure over again.
Wow.
And there are actually two adjacent rocks with a series of these figures carved into them.
Well, just a couple minutes left. What, like Ron said, what did you take away from it? But what do you hope to find, or what do you hope to discover before you say, I'm retired, I'm out of here, I'm going to let somebody else take over?
Well, I'm already in the process of letting, we've already hired my replacement.
Oh, okay.
But no, I'm going to hang around for quite a while, I hope.
You better.
And the trick is going to be convincing other scholars
Here we go.
about some of this. Nobody expected a site of this size. We all thought we knew what we were talking about and writing about. And I wrote in 2010 that these people lived in clusters of small villages. And yeah, we had 22 or 23 of them. One of the things we've done is to look between the recorded sites whenever we have the opportunity to see if we find more. And the answer so far has been yes. We're finding plenty. The intervening spaces are getting filled in. So this was.
Now, are you getting pushback on this, or are people accepting that these are the case, big cities?
Pushback on the actual size. Yeah, because scientists tend to, come to sort of vague agreements on things that are hard to understand. So how big was Cahokia? At one point, people were saying 50,000 people, and then it dwindled all the way down to 10,000, and then it's come back up a little bit. And it was sort of the standard accepted, that's how big it was.
Right.
Well, Cahokia was a very, very, very important place in its day. And we don't have that. We don't have the same kind of thing. But there's just no doubt we've got 20,000 people. And once we get our own magnetometer, and can cover all of the agricultural fields and map in all of these clusters of features that match the Spanish descriptions of clusters of 30 to 40 houses each, with pits and other features, we will be able to produce a map of the place that
I would love
ought
to
to
see
be really, really
cool.
convincing.
Yeah.
But then convincing people, convincing the linguists that Nahuatl, the Aztec language, was spoken in Kansas.
Right.
I know that's going to be a stretch. There's a standard accepted set of ideas, and it does not include that. And the standard accepted idea for the Southwest is, Pima was used as a trade language. And I've gone through all of the documents, and I can show that no, it wasn't. That there's really good evidence that Nahuatl was spoken from the Colorado River on east to Galveston Island, and as far north at least as Kansas, maybe further north. Part of the problem is the historic documents are not easy to interpret. In the Southwest, the people there, the Pueblo folks, were importing parrots, big parrots, the macaws, from somewhere to the south, and using those brightly colored feathers. Up in North Dakota, the earliest account of trade at a village up there mentions painted feathers. And I bet nobody ever bothered to paint a feather. I'm pretty sure that, well, I can't prove. There's no way to, unless somebody finds one somehow miraculously preserved, that macaw feathers were traded that far. But the bison products, bison rawhide shields, well down in Mexico, on the west coast of Mexico, all the way to the east coast of the United States, that's well documented. What we also have are a few pieces of obsidian from central Mexico and western Mexico. That again, it's going to take a lot of convincing. There's one that was found at a site called Spiro that got published, and a lot of people refer to that as the lone example of Central Mexican obsidian up in this general region. And it's one. We've got 7 pieces. And yeah, we know what it is. We can prove that with high-tech equipment. But getting people to believe that it was the natives that did it rather than a farmer on vacation, that's a hard thing to document.
Is this mostly, the older generation of researchers, archaeologists, professors, or are you also people of the up and coming archaeology?
It might be a little bit of that, but it's more that we scholars are trained to do one thing efficiently, and that's to throw out bad ideas. Okay, that's the essence of science.
Yeah.
What's a standard idea now might turn out to be a bad idea later on. If you can disprove it, people will move on. But we never actually prove anything. That's actually an impossibility. And so we're really trained to throw out, we call them type 1 errors, where you accept a falsehood. But there's a type 2 error that we hardly ever pay attention to, and that's ignoring good evidence. And so convincing my colleagues that, we've got a sequence of sites that have this same kind of obsidian. Plus we now have another piece from, if you know where Jalisco in Mexico is. We have 7 pieces of stuff from right near Mexico City. And we have this piece, Jalisco's on the west coast, well south. It turned up just this last summer. And when I told some of my colleagues about it, they went, oh, no, don't believe that. And I said, well, just a minute. I just 2 minutes ago told you about this piece of pottery we have in one of the sites. They came from North Dakota, and y'all believe that? And they went, yeah. And I said, well, it's not that much further. But we have pottery from North Dakota. We have pottery from East Texas. We have pottery from Nebraska. We have pottery from the Southwest. We have loads of obsidian from the Southwest. We've got pottery made in the Southwest, not a huge amount. They weren't as interested in that as the turquoise we've got quite a bit of. So yeah, I think they were the economic engine of North America in 1600.
It's
amazing.
That's amazing.
That is a hard thing to demonstrate to get enough people to go along with it.
It seems like we've interviewed, we've done almost 600 episodes, and we hear this over and over again.
Always.
New discoveries,
Yep.
the pushback, the fighting, no, it's not. That's not.
Can't be.
It can't. This is going to change history, but we don't want it. That type of thing. So, I thank you for putting your neck out there and getting down in Kansas City, but we call it Ark City, Kansas, and really bringing this to light, because that's
great.
Changes history.
You can be a proselytizer for me. We're right and they're wrong.
Right.
The original name of the river was Alcanza. It's a Native American word.
Arkansas.
You got to say halfway between an R and an L, Alcanza.
Ah.
And so, but the accent was definitely on the second syllable. And when Zebulon Pike came along, 1810, I guess, he mentioned that there was this, I've forgotten what he used, the word he used, but this terrible mispronunciation that was taken over Arkansas.
Yep. We used to always
he called it barbaric. That's the term.
We used to always make the people from Arkansas pissed off because we'd say Arkansas, and they're like, it's not Arkansas.
Oh, God.
But, we got to get out of here. But listen, you're going to have to come back and tell us more about some of these native cities that you're discovering all over the place, and we'd love to see some more, some of the artifacts. But in the meantime, people can watch this show, replay it, share it, and but is there another site? You mentioned you have some Facebook and other areas people can go to.
The name of the site of the town is the native name is Etzanoa,
Etzanoa.
Etzanoa. And if they just do a Google search on that, they'll find all sorts of stuff. They'll find our website. They'll find the Facebook page. I think there's something in Wikipedia now. I put something together, and then almost immediately some idiot rewrote it.
Oh, that's the bad thing about Wikipedia.
Like they know more than
anybody can change and add things. So
Exactly.
well, thank you
And
so
I'm
much.
not energetic enough to keep up with it.
Right. Well, thank you so much for being a part of Truth Be Told. You're part of the family now. Anytime you want to come back, let us know. But thank you for doing what you do, and appreciate all the people tuning in and listening. That they had some great comments and about what you're doing, and appreciate your changing history. So thank you so much.
You're most welcome.
All right, everybody. Thank you
If you have any way of sending the comments to me, I'd be interested in seeing them.
Yeah. I'll print them out and send them to you.
Okay, I appreciate that.
But thank you, everybody, for tuning in. We really appreciate you. I know it's been sporadic for us, but it's been a crazy time. But now we're back. We're going to get back in the studio. We have a lot of great guests coming up. Go to truthbetoldworldwide.com. Check out upcoming guests. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel. Leave comments, positive ones. You can leave negative ones. Just leave a negative one about Captain Ron. We don't care about it. And go subscribe to our Apple and iTunes and Spotify, Google Play, all that stuff, and listen to our podcast. Until next time, we appreciate you. Captain Ron, again, welcome back. All right.
Finally.
I know. Take care, everybody, and we'll talk to you soon.